Hi, my name is Luke Ashton, and I'll be giving you a short demonstration of our plant and utility capacity factor application. Capacity factor, as a basic understanding, is the total energy generated from a generation asset like a nuclear power plant, a solar farm, wind farm, divided by the total capacity of that generation asset. So we generate that number based on the nameplate capacity that's reported within the Energy Information Administration, and then also the actual generation as reported to the Energy Information Administration. So this is what is totally produced out of what it could produce if it was operating 365 days a year. So we've taken this data, we've combined it to multiple different EIA data sources and presented it into a concise format that you can see here. So there's three main components of this application. The first dashboard of that is, I like to call our utility command center. So kind of the main view of looking at a snapshot of a single utility to get a quick overview of their capacity factor. So to go ahead and do that here, I'll just go ahead and pick a company. So I'll go ahead and pick Pacific Gas and Electric. And automatically you'll see a few things change on the screen. The first off is we have the capacity factor over time by utility. So this is the total capacity factor of all their generation assets. So the sum of what was totally generated in megawatt hours divided by the total capacity in megawatt hours for all their generation assets. So that includes like Diablo Canyon, which is their nuclear plant, and all their solar and wind and other generation sources. You can see here, this is a breakdown of all their generation sources and their capacity. So you can see here, a lot of it is primarily water and hydro, but you can also look at natural gas, nuclear, solar, and then another category that is defined by the EIA. You can filter this by the energy source. So if you only want to look at the trend of nuclear over time, then you can do that. Below that, you'll see a capacity factor table. So this is looking at the total capacity factor over time to show you not just the capacity factor percentage, but also the raw inputs to that data. So that's going to be the utility generation in megawatt hours, as well as the total nameplate capacity within megawatt hours. So you can see how that changes over time. If you need to, you can also focus in on a particular year. So I'll go ahead and narrow down on 2022 and get a quick little view here. Once you kind of have an idea of what the capacity factor for a utility might be, there's a few ways you can go even deeper than that. If you want to dive into the particulars of the plants, then you can go ahead and dive into what we call our table view. The table view, first off, shows a bunch of different filters. This gives you a lot of different buttons to push and pulleys to pull and filters to be able to narrow down the tables below to your exact specifications. So it automatically defaults to the latest year, which is 2022. And say, for example, I want to look at all of the plants within the state of Alabama. So we'll go ahead and narrow that down here. We can see here are all of the companies within Alabama. So I can narrow it down to say like Alabama Power or Georgia Power Company or even Tennessee Valley Authority if they have some assets within the state of Alabama. We can also filter it by the energy source category. So if you want to look at specifically coal plants, nuclear plants, or even the sector. So you can be an independent power producer versus a traditional electric utility like Alabama Power. And you also have a lot of these different special statuses of the plant. So some of these plants may have a wholesale exemption that's given out by the FERC, as well as a cogeneration status, small producer status, or whether it actually is regulated. So an actual regulatory status of regulated versus non-regulated. So I'll go ahead and scroll down here and then say, for example, I only want to look at the regulated assets. So I'll go ahead and click on regulated. You can see here that it automatically changes the table. And given that we're looking at regulated assets, it naturally defaults to showing a lot of Alabama Power Company. But we also get the Alabama Municipal Electric Authority. So you can see all the plants break down there. You see a summary of all the data below. So we have 7 companies included in this list based on all the filters with 40 plants with a total nameplate capacity in megawatts of 22,000 megawatts and roughly 196, 197 million megawatt hours. So you can go down here and see the breakdown of all of those plants. So you can see here we have Alabama Power. One thing that we can do is you can sum all these together. So there's a couple ways to do that. If you have a utility that's operating in multiple states, you can click on the little line next to the state. And that'll narrow down just Alabama Power by the states. If you want to do the total, you'll see here that this little box with a line shows up, and then you can click on that and it applies it to the entire table to sum up by the states. And then you can do the same thing for all the companies. So I'll do the same thing here. And now I see the total breakdown of all the companies. And say, for example, I want to dive into the Tennessee Valley Authority. So I can go ahead and click on the plus icon next to Tennessee, all their assets within Alabama, and here are all of their generation assets within the state of Alabama, their nameplate capacity, both in megawatt and megawatt hours, as well as their net generation in megawatt hours, and then their total capacity factor at the end here. One other way I like using this table is to just download data en masse. So if you just want to take all this data, I can go ahead and expand all of it out here. And then this is a good way to just get the data. I can go ahead and click on this export button here. I get a CSV copy, as well as clicking on the expand details button here will give me a quick breakdown of the table. I can get a slightly different table format, click on the export, and I get a few different ways I can download that information. So I can do CSV, PowerPoint, Excel, whatever format that I need to do that. And you can do this for any visualization. It doesn't have to be a table. It can be any of the visualizations I showed a little bit earlier, or any of the visualizations and tables that I'll show in a little bit here. The last component of our application is our benchmarking capability. So this allows you to take a single company or series of companies against another series or single company. So for example, I want to go ahead and look at the main companies and peer companies. You must use both of these. And you'll note that it automatically defaults to a control must include. You can treat this record as a company. It must be included in order for the visualizations to work. It does not have any data associated with that record, so it won't impact any of the averages for capacity factor, but it must be included for the visualizations below to work fully. So it automatically defaults to that. So all you gotta do is just add on different companies that you want. So say, for example, I wanna look at Duke. So there's a bunch of different Duke entities. I wanna prioritize some of the larger utilities. So automatically you can see here that Duke is now the main series of companies. So when we're talking about the capacity factor, this is the sum of all of the Duke entities I clicked on. This is the sum of their generation divided by the sum of their capacity for all their generation assets, summing up to all of those companies. So it's an extra layer of summing, and then it's taking that generation divided by that nameplate capacity and getting the capacity factor. So you can see here it goes across on screen on blue, but you can also see that it breaks down the capacity factor by all those companies that I selected on the visualization on the bottom left-hand side. So it gives you a quick look to say like, hey, you know, Duke Energy, which company is this? Duke Energy Ohio actually has a fairly low capacity factor. So if I wanted to, I could go ahead and say like, hey, maybe I don't want Duke Energy Ohio within that list. I can go ahead and go back to the filter, deselect it, and now I have a much more normalized list of utilities that I'm working with. Similarly, I can then include peer companies. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the filter on the right-hand side here and look at peer companies. And now I want to bring in all of the Entergy assets. So let's go ahead and pick Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, New Orleans, and Texas. And now you can see that all the peer companies are in this gray bar running across the screen here, as well as by those peer companies that you can see below here. So each Entergy utility that I selected is now broken down into individual companies. So again, I see that one of the companies, Entergy New Orleans, has a fairly low capacity factor. So if I didn't want to include that, I can then go back in, look at Entergy, and then I could deselect Entergy New Orleans, and now I have a much more normalized list. What's great about this is it's not just the total generation that you're looking at. You can actually split out that by the energy source. So if I only want to look at, say, nuclear, then I can go ahead and take a look at nuclear. And we can see here there's two Duke entities that have nuclear and two Entergy utilities that have nuclear. So you can see here that the capacity factor for the Duke-controlled nuclear plants are actually slightly higher than the Entergy-controlled nuclear plants. So roughly, Entergy looks to be between like 80 to 85, 87%. And then Duke here is actually on the high 80s, low 90s. So you can do that for any energy source. If you want to switch it over to say geothermal, I'm curious to see which one has geothermal. They don't have geothermal, that's okay. We can go ahead and switch it over to coal. And there we go. So a lot of coal assets from Duke, a couple of Entergy utilities have it. And you can see that the capacity factor is actually going down over time, which would be a little bit interesting to do some research on. So that is the plant and utility capacity factor. As I mentioned before, all this is downloadable for data as well as the visualizations you can throw into reports. And at that point, you can look at any of this that you want to. You can go back to any of the screens and control which aspects of these capacity factors that you want to take a look at. And let us know if you have any questions. If you do have any questions, please reach out to our customer success team, and they can give you a quick demonstration as well as the written documentation that's associated with this video.